Welcome to our session, Students as Digital Historians. I'm Sandra Hogue, and I'm joined today by Missy Calloway, who is pulling double duty right now as a full-time English teacher at Butler High School, but also serves as the AIC. So just standing in the stead of a person who vacated their spot for a promotion, Missy is more than busy these days. And then we're also joined by Connie Poche, who is librarian at Audubon Traditional School. So just a quick overview of the session. Here's the journey we hope to take you on this afternoon. We wanted to give you context. Why? Why consider encouraging students to use their voices, especially at this time as digital historians. Connie's going to carry us through that, as well as the arts in the time of COVID-19, helping us to understand how the arts really do complement student voices, especially during hard times. I'm going to then move us into looking at students, encouraging students and us as adults as well to live as archivists, using a process called Photovoice, a research data collection tool, and also folding in poetry into that. And then Missy will bring us to a conclusion for the session by looking at lived experiences of high school students. And so she's going to carry us on the journey that she has a group of students actively working during NTI at this current time using similar processes. And so that's the journey we plan to take you on this afternoon. And we're going to start with just this quick quote that really feels fitting right now. For some moments in life, there just are no words. And so thankful to Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory for that. But if you think about what's happening in the world right now with COVID, sometimes it is hard to find the words. But Connie's going to give us context by helping us to understand the why behind our what this afternoon. Connie?
Okay, thank you. So we began this journey, the three of us as educators, through a conversation about how our students are reacting to their now. I have been texting my students and we've been having conversations back and forth, and then also having a conversation with my college-age daughter about, well, what do I do now? Our students have lost connections with their friends. They've had their lives completely changed, their routines disrupted, and we started discussing how it is that they process what they're going through. How do they deal with their anxiety? They are hearing adult conversations, they're seeing news, and it's overwhelming when you're a child. So how do we help them work through their anxieties, find small joys? That's something that Sandra brought to us last week, where you are looking for the good in your life. And then how do we give our children voice when we don't even know what to say during this process? We don't know how to cope with what's happening to us. So we moved to next slide. All right. Talking about the arts in the time of COVID-19. So compared to adults, children have a much more difficult time dealing with anxiety and traumatic events. They expect us to be the ones that guide them and give them stability, but their upheaval starts to come out, usually with children, behaviorally. So looking into art, I've always been passionate about combining art with any kind of discipline. We wanted to do some research first, which was, when you're making art, when you are creating, whether it is artistically, musically, poetically, you're reducing your stress levels. And so that's not just important for kids, that's important for us right now. A lot of us are going through stress because we're having to deal with our new unknown. So we came up with our own ways to approach this. For me, because I deal with elementary students, I decided to combine art with poetry. So I informally questioned my kids. I love a Google form. So they gave me feedback, and what I found was my kids really do enjoy art and they enjoy poetry, but they don't like to write it. And one of the comments that really touched me is that no prompting, my student said, poetry clears my mind of bad things, like especially during coronavirus. So that to me is a student that's looking out, wanting an escape. So here's how we started our process in an elementary level setting. I give the students a poem about a topic. For this one, just because this is how we're starting, I chose something very relatable. I know with my family, we've been going on these walks every night, and we've been able to really notice the changes in nature. So I came up with a very spring-centered song. The students' assignment for the week is that they are going to give me an image that speaks to them when they read the poem. So if you look at that, my image board came out like this because this is what I have at home. So, these are just things that when I hear the poem, it speaks to me. The flowers and birds' nests and the fact that I finally get to pull out the patio furniture because we're all going to hang out on the patio again. That's spring to me. Students would give me their images. So we start with a visual representation because we're using what the kids have at home, and it's just responding to poetry. What's one medium that all of our kids have? A cell phone. Either their parent has a cell phone or they have a cell phone. They are used to digital innovation. They are very good at using technology. So you can photograph, you can draw, you can create any way you want, and then they have to submit the image to me. So what my role is, I'll just take you through the process with the kids. All right. So we start by sharing the poem, and I share it first with a voice file because I feel like poetry needs to be spoken. So first it's just them hearing my voice, and then I give them a written copy so that they can digest it. They are the ones that create the what and the why. They create their image, and then they have to explain to me why they chose that image, why they chose the medium they chose, and then what it means to them. Now, how do we curate this? As the adult, I collect the images, and then I create a slide deck that has their responses. However, I make sure if I'm going to share an image, I have the student's permission, and they let me know if they can have their name attached to it. Because sometimes as our children are processing, they're processing deep emotions, and they may not feel comfortable with everyone seeing their work. They may not feel comfortable with people knowing that that's their work. So we always, as an educator, if we're going to do this, ask permission. All right. So that's our art process. But poetry isn't always sunshine. So you're not going to always have a beautiful poem. Art isn't always sunshine either. So there may be things that come through in art that aren't what you expect. So I'll take you through our art process now, which is basically, poetry process. Sorry about that. We flip the script. This time, instead of me providing the imagery or the writing, they're going to start creating it. However, I don't want this to become, you're going to write a poem, because that's when my students freeze up. So we're just going to start thinking like poets. We are just going to immerse ourselves in the language of poetry. So for this, I would share an image with the students and then have them respond just with a phrase, just with a sentence, just with words, not an entire poem. And my role in this is to gather their responses and then guide discussion. So let's show you what that looks like. I had a session last week with Jamboards, which was just amazing. I think Jamboards are a blast, and I think the kids would love this. So we start with an image. You see the starry night sky, and then they just give me phrases. They give me what they feel when they see that image. And that's it. We might go back and discuss, okay, how could you make this more descriptive? Or we might give feedback, but it's not writing a poem yet. It is just thinking like a poet and living in the image and living in the words that come from the image. Okay, let's see. And then it does address standards, because while I am in the library and I have different library standards, I like to support my teachers any way I can. So I have a list, and I'm not going to read them to you, but standards that this hits. I mean, it takes care of, it works with theme and perspective and point of view, and your students are using digital resources. They are using digital resources if they're using photography. They're using digital resources when they're responding. So they also get a chance to interact and collaborate when they are doing the Jamboard. And I feel like our students are looking for a connection. They love the Zoom meetings where they get to hang out and talk to their classmates. They love just having some back and forth. I get random emails because they just are looking for that connection. So the standards are there. And then I've also attached just some additional reading. There are links there for you that I think we have to realize that when our students come back to us, they are going to come back after being gone out of an education setting for 6 months. And so we have to start thinking about the trauma. Even though, we're all safe at home on our couches, there's still a sense of loss. So those are just some resources if you'd like to see them to help get your thinking started on that. All right, I think it's Sandra's turn now.
Excellent. Thank you, Connie. So just to branch out further on this idea of thinking of students as digital historians, especially during this NTI time, this coronavirus time, one of the things that I'm looking at, especially with my own personal children, is thinking about us being archivists, using photo voice and poetry, as I mentioned, and oftentimes, and the sentence there says, "Those living in a condition or through an event are the best tellers of their own stories." If we think about what happens in the media and how there are stereotypes formed because the media shows us their angle on a certain community, photo voice is a process that allows the people or the person living in an event or through an event or in a condition to be able to have the voice to speak their own truth. And so there you see an example from my daughter, who is involved in that photo in a 5K, a digital 5K during Easter. And those are Easter eggs that are hot glued to the back of her shirt because she wanted to be festive. But her photo voice entry or artifact for that event, it's the language is there. It says Safe Distance Fitness, Louisville, Kentucky, April 2nd, 2020. It's a digital photo. We want to keep a safe distance to stay healthy. So we do virtual 5Ks around our neighborhood. We dress up and try to stay festive during a sad time. And that's by Reagan Hogue. So that's an artifact that's been designed to placehold this era in time, this space in time for us and for her as an archivist. So photo voice really puts the camera in the hands of those who are, as I said, living in a community. Its origin comes from China. That's where it started. And it was designed to give voice to, as I said, marginalized communities. And so they started with photos and then invited them to collaborate, to put words to those images. And then the ultimate goal is to act, to collect those voices so that they have additional power to change things for a community that may be marginalized. And so our process, the process I'm using with my children, we decide, and this is one I would use in the classroom, one that I used in my research for my degree. You decide on a theme or a compelling question, an umbrella idea for the group to explore. So they have to, once again, they have to be related in context in order to find those connections. And so you prepare the group by letting them know how many images you'd like them to gather. I can tell you 10 per participant is way too many. 2 or 3 that capture their reality, and then let them know the platform, let them know how you plan to gather those images from them, whether it's a disposable camera or digital images with the cell phone, etc. And then there's an art gallery curation process that you let them know, we're going to put these together in a museum-like format, right? And so with my kiddos and with my research, they create a placard, one that lets the audience know the context of the image. And so then the curator of the material collects and processes the images. The group comes together then face-to-face to codify. And in the day of NTI, maybe it's not face-to-face, maybe it's virtually, but they come together to find those themes, to identify the things that bubble up as common factors in those experiences. And then they synthesize the learning, and it gives way for them to act. And that's the goal, for them to do something with, to empower, to do something with the material they've gathered. So even as archivists, that action may look different than, say, a marginalized community just trying to get laws changed, right? That act looks different than us as archivists during COVID. And so here's just a screenshot of what my kids and I have started to put together. And what we did was look at mentor text. My kids had never written a placard for a museum piece. And so I went online to find examples of those. We looked at them. We noticed the contents, what was critical, what's important for a piece that's going into a museum. And so we modeled from that mentor our entries. And so you'll see that the ones on the screen follow that same pattern that was in the one that I used at the start. And our big question was, in what ways has the coronavirus changed your daily life? Because I think, once again, as archivists, it's important that we placehold this. In fact, I had my son at the dining room table, who's down here at the bottom of the screen. He was working on his and was having trouble understanding the why behind this what. And I explained to him that his grandchildren would see this someday. And he looked at me like, I don't have grandchildren. I said, but just imagine, when you're old and gray and you have grandchildren, they'll be able to understand this experience you've lived. And so then we've taken that from this museum, and we will have a buffet of images. We're going to have far more than 3 per person, just depending on how long COVID lasts, quite frankly. But we moved into the poetry process, once again, to enhance the way of the variety of ways in which my kiddos and I are placeholding this experience as archivists. And so you revisit the whole buffet of images you have in Photovoice entries, but you don't need a poem for each of them. You grab one that speaks to you especially, and then you tap into your head and heart and think about how you might take that into poetic form. And so this is an example from my daughter who, once again, when we were ready for this process, I handed her a stack of poetry books from my collection here at home and said, I need you to find out what are the essential components of good poetry. And so she filled a list, and I don't know how well you guys can see. I'm sharing my screen, so I know you can't see it. But she created a list, 2 sides of the paper, where she noticed things about the poems that she loved and the collections I had. And then she applied that to, this is the first one she created. It's a list poem. And you can read that. You don't need me reading that to you, but that's something she came up with. And, including no hospital visits, because that speaks to our reality. My mother was rushed at the beginning of this into emergency surgery one night, and we were told that they didn't think she would survive. And by the grace, she came out of it, but we were unable to see her. And so for my children, as Connie mentioned earlier, that presents some form of trauma for them, right? To have their granny in the hospital and no one gets to see her face. And so this is one on the next screen here, one that I crafted. And what you'll see in the blue box on the left is the mentor text that I used to create the piece. And then my inspired piece next to it, which you guys can explore at any time. But the image that I began with is on the right, down at the waterfront. I'm sure you'll recognize that. But I created, once again, the Photovoice placard first, and then inspired by a mentor text, took that into a poem of my own that, once again, will be something that we will archive as part of this experience during the Corona period. And so connections with the standards, once again, as JCPS educators, you don't need me, as Connie said, to read those to you. Feel free to explore those. That link at the top will take you directly to them if you'd like to look further. And then it also connects with social studies. If you think about their inquiry practices, this is questioning, right? We are coming from an umbrella question. We are investigating, we are using evidence, and we are communicating our conclusions in the form of the artifacts that we generate. And then publishing opportunities. There are you can have a personal or family time capsule. You can have them published in a book at Walgreens. There are projects online, though, that are part of larger bodies of archivists who are in the business of placeholding events like this. And so there are links there for you to explore. I did link us to, if you look at JCPS Backpack and Defenses, if you think about it, the AR tool, poetry may be a form of presenting their defenses for their next level promotion. If we think at 5th, 8th, and 12th grade, some kiddos speak poems, and it is a natural language for them, whether it's through rap or whether it's through poetry in the traditional sense. And the AR tool reminds us that it's important for us to allow students' gifts to shine. And so that's why I linked the AR tool there. And then poetry in higher education, the other link I have at the bottom is to a young man from Clemson University who crafted his entire dissertation as a playlist. And so he wrote verse to capture his journey to his through his dissertation research. And so there has to be room for understanding, even though poetry diminishes in the standards as we move up, there's certainly a place for that, especially as we think about gifted and talented, and we think about student voice and choice, and we think about the AR tool and allowing students to walk in the gifts that they possess. And so next we're going to move to Missy, which she's going to talk with us about Photovoice and her experiences with high school.
Hi, so as Sandra said earlier, I'm wearing two hats right now, the AIC hat at Butler, but we also had a teacher who moved to a district position right at the beginning of NTI, and I didn't want her students to be without an English teacher, so I stepped in and I'm teaching her classes as well. So NTI has given me a chance to put a foot back in the classroom, which is delightful. So one of the things that I decided I would explore with the kids in the African American literature class that I'm teaching, we're in the midst of an author study of Audrey Lorde. And so I think Photovoice fits really well as a place to honor student voice, to have them be creators, to have them critique professional writing, to approximate the work that they're seeing happening in Lorde. And if you're not familiar with Audrey Lorde, she's an essayist, but she's also a poet, and she was an activist. So it's a nice fit. And then I'm challenging them to do a little bit of extension and maybe step out of a format that they are always comfortable to turning to and try some poetry. So the other thing that's important to note is these are upperclassmen, 11th and 12th graders. And, the 12th graders are really feeling the loss of not being in a classroom and not having the end of their senior year. So this is a space for me to honor their voice and capture their first person accounts of a 12th grade year that they didn't expect. In the second week of NTI, I asked students to read an Audrey Lorde essay, Litany for Survival, and they were asked to interpret meaning, they were asked to interpret artistry, what they see and hear in the poem, their likes and dislikes, and where the poem leads their thought. And then the next one, they read an essay, Transformation of Silence into Language and Action. And again, they were being asked to respond to what they saw happening in the essay, to walk back to the poem, see what was similar. And then I also added a level of where they looked at an illustrated Lorde quote that I found from Teaching Tolerance. And if Sandra, you would advance that one, please, for us, so we can take a look at the image. There we go. So this was an Audrey Lorde quote image that was in, go back one, please, in Teaching Tolerance magazine. So I used this as a discussion board in Google Classroom where kids responded to the quote, but also responded to one another. So they were having some conversation. And then we moved into, okay, so what does this look like for you? How do you do this with your own writing? So this was the assignment from the African American Lit class. I asked them to review the poem, to review the essay, to do some annotation, and then pick one phrase or sentence that stands out to you. And I wanted them to capture with camera, or even though illustration is not a photo voice tool, I gave that as an option as well, for them to capture an image, their artistic interpretation of the image, and then to write a little bit about it. And we'll take a look at the second half of the assignment. So then I asked them to write a fat paragraph, which is what Sandra had as her museum placard, the paragraph about the who, the where, the why, the how of the image, and why it's their interpretation of what Lorde does in her poetry or in her essay. I asked them to put it in a Google Doc or on a Google slide so that we do have a single image with information. And then I did some models for them. So I modeled after an Emily Dickinson poem, Hope is the Thing with Feathers. I had a once-in-a-lifetime event with a tufted titmouse that crashed into my front door, and I capitalized on it. So this would be the essay version of what it looks like with the image. And then I also did some approximation, with apologies to Emily Dickinson, of an extension of the event in a poem, just so that the kids would have something to take a look at. And so for you, I have provided the standards, which are very similar to the standards addressed in the other speakers' lessons. And then I also have included a slide that has links to some Audrey Lorde work and my individual assignments, in case you are interested in taking a look at the why and how of how that works. And here's our contact information. We'd love to hear from you, Connie at Audubon Traditional, and of course Sandra, our AIS ELA lead, and I am Missy Calloway, the AIC at Butler Traditional, and also for NTI, an English teacher. We're so pleased that you guys joined us. Thank you.
It was amazing, ladies. That was just Sandra, Missy, Connie. Your title is almost misleading as students as digital historians, because I was watching the chat. We saw digital historians, digital poets, digital artists, digital writers, digital mindfulness in the NTI, just so many great things that we saw, we were pulling out. There's so much information packed into that. That was great.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. Were there any questions? Any questions we need to address right now?
No, there were not. It was lots of good conversation going on. I was very happy. It was great chat going on about it. Thank you.
Okay, good deal. Well, thank you guys for having us. And if you have any feedback, if you have any extensions, if you have any ideas about how we can enhance and make this even better, by all means, please let us know. Because just like everyone else at NTI, we are exploring and feeling footloose and fancy free for trying new things. So thank you guys.
All right. Thank you. Yes, absolutely. We were all learning together, and that was so much help for a lot of people. Thank you.